Chapter 3. I was frightened to find myself entirely alone, but I remembered the two things which, according to Olga, were necessary for survival without human help. The first was a knowledge of the plants and animals, familiarity with poisons and medical herbs. The other was a possession of fire, or a comet of one's own. The first was harder to obtain. It required a great deal of experience. The second consisted merely of one quart preserve can, open at one end, with a lot of small nail holes punched in the side. A 3-foot loop of wire was hooked to the top of the can by way of a handle, so that one could swing it either like a lasso or like a censer in a church. Such a small portable stove could serve as a constant source of heat and as a miniature kitchen. One filled it with any kind of fuel available, always keeping some sparks of fire at the bottom. By swinging the can energetically, one pumped air through the holes, the blacksmith does with his bellows, while centrifuge force kept the fuel in place. A judicious choice of fuel, an appropriate swinging motion permitted the building up of heat suitable for various purposes, while steadily stoking, preventing the comet from going out. For example, the baking of potatoes, turnips, or fish required a slow fire of peat and damp leaves, and the roasting of freshly killed bird required the live flame of dry twigs and hay. Birds' eggs, freshly plucked from their nests, were best cooked on a fire of potato stalks. To keep the fire alight through the night, the comet had to be tightly packed with damp moss collected from the bases of the tall trees. The moss burned with a dim glow, producing smoke which repelled snakes and insects. In case of danger, it could be brought to a white heat in a few swings. On wet, snowy days, the comet had to be refilled frequently with dry, resinous wood or bark, and required a lot of swinging. On windy or hot, dry days, the comet did not need much swinging, and its burning could be further slowed down by adding fresh grass or by sprinkling it with some water. The comet was also indispensable protection against dogs and people. Even the most vicious dogs stopped short when they saw a wildly swinging object showering with sparks, which threatened to set their fur on fire. Not even the boldest man wanted to risk losing his sight or having his face burned. A man armed with a loaded comet became a fortress and could be safely attacked only with a long pole or by throwing rocks. That is why the extinction of a comet was an extremely serious thing. It could happen through carelessness, oversleeping, or a sudden downpour. Matches were very scarce in that area. They were costly and hard to obtain. Those who had any matches got into the habit of splitting each match in half for economy. Fire was therefore preserved almost scrupulously in kitchen stoves in the firebox of the ovens. Before retiring for the night, women would bank up the ash to make certain the embers would keep glowing until morning. At dawn, they reverently made the sign of the cross before blowing the fire back to life. Fire, they said, is no natural friend to man. That is why one must humor it. It was also believed that the sharing of fire, especially borrowing it, could only result in misfortune. After all, those who borrow fire on earth might have to return it in hell. In carrying fire out to the house might make the cows dry or go barren. Also, a fire that went out could produce disastrous consequences in case of childbirth. Just as fire was essential to the comet was essential to life. A comet was necessary for approaching human settlements, which were guarded by packs of savage dogs. And in the winter, extinguished comet might lead to frostbite, as well as a lack of cooked food. People always carried small sacks in their backs or at the pelts for collecting fuel for their comets. In the daytime, peasants working the fields baked vegetables, birds, and fish in them. At night, men and boys coming home would swing them with all strength and let them fly into the sky, burning fiercely like soaring red discs. The comets flew in a wide arc. Their fiery tails traced down the courses. This is how they got their name. They did really look like comets in the skies, with their flaming tails, whose appearance, as Olga explained, signified war, plague, and death. It was very difficult to obtain a can for a comet. These were found only along the distant railroad tracks, which carried military transports. The local peasant prevented outsiders from collecting them, extracting a high price for the cans they found themselves. Communities on each side of the tracks fought over the cans. Every day they sent out teams of men and boys equipped with sacks for any can they could find, and armed with axes to ward off any competitors. I was given my first comet by Olga, who received it for a payment for treating a patient. I took a very good care of it, hammering out the holes that threatened to become too large, flattened dents, and polished the metal. Anxious not to be robbed, my only important possession, I wrapped some of the wire attached to the handle around my wrist and never parted from my comet. The brisk sparkle fire filled me with a feeling of security and pride. I never missed an opportunity to fill my sack with the right kind of fuel. Olga often sent me to the woods for certain plants and herbs with curative properties, and I felt perfectly safe as long as I had my comet with me. But Olga was now far away, and I was without my comet. I shivered with cold and fear, as my feet were bleeding from cuts of the sharp blades of water reeds. I brushed off my calves and thighs and leeches, which swelled visibly as they sucked my blood. Long, crooked shadows fell over the river, and muffled sounds crept along the murky banks. In the creaking of the thick beech branch, in the rustling of the willow trees, trailing their leaves in the water, I heard the utterance of the mysterious beings of whom Olga had spoken. They took on peculiar shapes, serpentine, and peaked of faces, having a bat's head and a snake's body, and they coiled themselves around a man's legs, drawing on his will to live out of him until he sat down on the ground in search of a slumber for which there was no awakening. I had sometimes seen such strange-shaped snakes in the barn, where they terrified the cows into agitated mooing. They were said to drink the cow's milk, or even worse, to crawl inside the animal and consume all the food they ate until the cows starved to death. Cutting through the reeds of the tall grass, I started running away from the river, forcing through the barricades of tangled weeds, bending low to squeeze under the overhang branches, almost impaling myself on sharp reeds and thorns. A cow moved far away. I quickly climbed a tree, and after scanning the countryside from its height, I noticed the twinkle of comets. People were coming home from the pastures. Cautiously I made my way to that direction, listening for a sound of their dogs, which came towards me through the undergrowth. The voices were quite close. There was obviously a path behind the thick wall of foliage. I heard the shuffle of the walking cows and the voice of the young shepherds. Now then some sparks from the comet lipped up the dark sky and zigzagged down into oblivion. I followed them along the bushes, determined to attack them and to seize a comet. The dogs had with them picked up my scent several times. It dashed into the bushes, but evidently did not feel too secure in the path. When I hissed like a snake, it withdrew to the path, growling from time to time. The shepherds, sensing danger, grew silent and listened to the sounds of the forest. I approached the lane. The cows almost rubbed their flanks against the branches. behind which I was hiding. They were so close I could feel the heat of their bodies. The dog tried another attack, but hissing drove it back to the road. When the cows moved closer to me, I jabbed two of them with a sharp stick. They bellowed and started trotting, followed by the dog. Then I screamed with a long, vibrating banshee howl and struck the nearest shepherd in the face. Before he had time to realize what was happening, I grabbed his Comet and sped back into the bushes. The other boys, frightened by the eerie howl and the panic of the cows, started running towards the village, dragged their dazed shepherd with them. Then I went deeper into the forest, dampening the bright fire of the Comet with some fresh leaves. When I was far enough, I blew at the Comet. Its light lured scores of odd insects out of the dark. I saw witches hanging from the trees. They stared at me, tried to lead me astray and confuse me. I distinctly heard the shudders of wandering souls which had escaped from the bodies of penitent sinners. In the rusty glow of the Comet, I saw trees bending over me. I heard the plaintive voices and strange movements of mysterious ghosts and ghouls trying to bore their way out from inside their trunks. Here and there I saw axe cuts on tree trunks. I remembered that Olga had told me that each cuts were made by peasants trying to cast evil spells on their enemies. Striking the juicy flesh of the tree with the axe, one hand to utter the name of the hated person and to visualize his face. The cut would bring disease and death to the enemy. There were many such scars on the trees around me. People here must have had many enemies that were quite busy in their efforts to bring them disaster. Frightened, I swung the Comet wildly. I saw unending rows of trees bowing obsequiously to me, inviting me to step deeper and deeper into their closing ranks. Sooner or later, I had to heed their invitation. I wanted to stay away from the riverside villages. I went ahead, firmly convinced that Olga's spells would eventually bring me back to her. Didn't she always say that if I tried to run away, she would bewitch my feet and make them bring me back to her? I had nothing to fear. Some unknowing force, either from above or within myself, was leading me unerringly back to old Olga.